us know so many things about environmental law and wildlife laws from so many books. We have so many textbooks and treatises. But being in the field, what I realized is when you actually start practicing in the field of conservation, or when you start doing various field work in the field of conservation, laws are there, but they're somewhere in the periphery. What we really need to understand is the ground management of various resources. And there are certain basic concepts that we need to understand, and that helps us better as students of law to understand the laws themselves. And very often we use so many terms interchangeably. So, at least as students of law, let's try to understand what each of these concepts mean in their real perspective. So, keeping that as the background, I thought I will try and discuss some of the basic concepts in forest and conservation laws, wildlife and forest laws. Okay, so first and foremost, since you've already had so many lectures, I don't have to talk about the difference between environmental laws and forest and wildlife laws. Suffice to understand that environmental laws like Environmental Protection Act, Air Act, Water Act, that comes under a different category. And wildlife and forest laws come under what we call as conservation laws. Now, when we're talking about wildlife and forest conservation in India, from a practicing point of view, there are only about 3 or 4 laws that are really, really relevant, and we have to be very thoroughly proficient in. And that is, as far as the forest management is concerned, we have the Indian Forest Act of 1927. And there are various states which have their own state versions of the forest laws. Like in Karnataka, we have the Karnataka Forest Act of 1963. And in Karnataka, we also have another interesting act, which is called the Karnataka Tree Preservation Act. Strictly speaking, that is not for forest preservation, it's more for tree preservation. So we have the Forest Acts, then we have the Wildlife Conservation Act of 1972, and we have the Forest Conservation Act of 1980. Now, within the triangle of these 3 laws, we have the entire forest and wildlife conservation of our country taking place. Incidentally, we also have another law, which is called the Biodiversity Conservation Act 2002. It does conserve to some extent, but it is in practice, though there are certain relevant provisions, in practice, it is more adhered to in terms of the IPRs concerned and certain indigenous products and their protection. So strictly speaking, not strictly into the domain of conservation laws in the real sense of the word from a field point of view. Okay, so now when we are talking about wildlife, very often we talk about wild animal, wildlife, all animals. Now, that's another distinction that we have to make and understand. Wildlife conservation is different from animal protection. We have the Prevention of Cruelty Against Animal Act. That is about animal rights. Now, wildlife and forest management is not about animal rights. We have wildlife as in wild animals coming in as a part of that regimen, but animal rights is a different field of law altogether. So now we kind of have an approximate idea of what are the boundaries and borders of wildlife and forest conservation. Fine. So before we get into anything, let's understand the various categorization of forests, because if we are protecting something, we need to understand what we are protecting. So there are so many random terminologies that we come across day in and day out when we talk about forest conservation or wildlife conservation. Now, each law has its own categorization of forests, and it has its own regimen for each category of forests. So the forest laws being earlier than wildlife laws, let's first get into the Forest Act. So by and large, there are 4 categories of forest under the forest laws. The first category is reserve forest. Reserve forest is the highest degree of protection that is given to a forest under the forest law regime. So very often, I mean, a lot of reserve forests are eventually converted into sanctuaries or national parks. There are a lot of restrictions and there are very stringent penalties for whatever violations are committed within a reserve forest. So it is a state government area which is owned by the government, managed by the government, and by default, it is zero interference from anyone else. And if a concerned officer or it would be where we have the concept of settlement of rights, where some people have their agricultural lands within the reserve forest, or they have a way through which they have to travel through the reserve forest. So certain rights which are given. Except for those rights, a reserve forest is the most protected category of forest under the forest laws. Then after that, we have the village forest. Village forest also is a protected forest, but to some extent, there are some community rights given. We talk about grazing rights, we talk about fodder rights, we talk about timber rights, fire and fuel rights, where the local villagers can gather, but very, very restricted. Village forest has the second highest degree of protection. And then we have the district forest. District forest is by and large a situation where there is government control, but there are also rights of the villagers in and around. And a portion of the district forest may at times be categorized as a protected forest. Now, when we hear the word protected forest, we obviously think protected forest is the most protected category, but it's just the opposite. Protected forest has a very, very negligible kind of regulation, but by and large, people can exercise their rights. We also have the concept of joint forest management, where we have the government kind of coordinating with the local villagers. And for example, in a village forest, we have something called the village forest committees. So the entire focus is on protection of the resources. The earlier approach during the British period was to completely keep away the common man from the forest, make these forests watertight compartments exclusively for the use of the sovereign. But now we have realized the more you restrict and prohibit people, the more you're going to instigate them to do harm to the forest. Like, for example, forest fires. So the more I feel restricted, the more I feel I am denied what is my rightful access to a particular forest or a particular resource, I will show my anger at the state by starting a forest fire. All of you must be aware, most of the forest fires are man-made. They're intentional most of the time. So that is when the government said, let us have a participative approach. And that is where you have, apart from the reserve forest, you have these village forests, district forests, and protected forests, where you have the people joining in and conserving. So that concept of CPR, community property rights, where the community feels that sense of ownership. At the same time, with that sense of ownership, they all feel it is their bounden duty to protect that resource. So there is a corroborative and collaborative approach between the government and the local communities to manage these forests. So this is the categorization as far as the forest acts are concerned. Then we come to the Wildlife Protection Act 1972. Now, originally, there were two main categories of forests that were provided for. We call them as protected areas. One was the national park, the other one was sanctuary, what we call as the wildlife sanctuary. I'm sure most of us have visited a national park or a sanctuary. So these two categories were supposed to be absolute inviolate areas, meant exclusively set. There are some areas where you cannot totally do away with public interference. We have to take the community with us. And that is where in the year 2002, there were two more categories that were introduced, which is community forest reserve and conservation reserve. Community and conservation reserve. And then in 2006, we have another category being introduced, which is the tiger reserve. So we have 5 types of categories for protecting forests or wildlife habitat, as we call it under the Wildlife Protection Act, which is the national park, the wildlife sanctuary, the conservation reserve, the community reserve, and the tiger reserve. Now, of these, the national park has the highest degree of protection. Absolute inviolate areas, absolutely as per the law, absolutely no rights whatsoever granted to the public, exclusively meant for the wildlife of the region. Sanctuary, as good as a national park, but there are certain limited rights granted, maybe a right to weigh. In very, very exceptional cases, a bit of grazing rights given, but on the periphery or the fringes to that extent. So as of now, sanctuaries and national parks have the highest degree of protection. Then we have the conservation reserve. Conservation reserve is a category where there is important wildlife movement happening, but you cannot make them inviolate like a sanctuary or a national park because of various practical factors. So what they do is they will declare, very often animal corridors, wildlife corridors are designed or designated as conservation reserves. So the government does protect as much as possible. There is restriction of movement. Encouragement is for the wildlife to thrive in these conservation reserves. Then you have community reserves. Community reserves is where there would be someone who, they may be a private land, or there may be a CPR, there may be a village owned piece of land, where the people concerned are voluntarily willing to give it up for conservation and help in the process of conservation. Very similar to the concept of village forest that we were talking about, a sort of a joint management. So that is what community reserve is about. So there will be certain fuel and fodder rights and to some extent grazing rights, but the focus is of protection, which is the national park and the sanctuaries. Then there is a second rung of protection, the conservation reserve. And then you have a third rung of protection to territory, which is the community reserve. So these are the four main categories of protected areas under the Wildlife Protection Act. 2006, we have the Tiger Reserve. Now, this concept of Tiger Reserve was originally not there in our legislative system, in our laws. We have something called the Project Tiger. All of you must be aware of it. It's a flagship project that was adopted by the Indian government to save our national animal, which is the tiger. And today, if we have a healthy tiger population in our country, we owe it entirely and to a large extent to this Project Tiger concept, where they kept the tiger as the focus species and they tried to conserve the habitat around the tiger. So incidentally, all those other wildlife, all the other wild animals or other wildlife habitat that were crucial for the sustenance of the tiger also got protected in the process. So it was a species plus species habitat protection approach that was adopted in the Project Tiger process. So it became so successful that the government said, let us give this a legislative status. And that is how I was mentioning about the Biodiversity Act. Biodiversity Act has something called a biodiversity heritage site concept. So this is, you can't call it a protected area, but a certain area is identified because it has got a certain biodiversity resource which needs protection or which is unique to that place or which needs to be preserved. In that sort of a situation, the government, the local authority, and the local community also joins in and they protect that particular area. So you have something called the Biodiversity Management Committee, which has stakeholders, the government and the local administration jointly coming together to preserve and protect a biodiversity heritage site. So that is the only protection concept that we have under the Biodiversity Act. Then we come to the environmental laws. As I said, strictly environmental laws are a separate category by themselves, but all of you must be aware of this concept of EIA, Environment Impact Assessment Notification, where you have the concept of an Environment Impact Assessment report. So whenever a project has to be started, you have to have an EIA report on the basis of which they decide whether a project is feasible or not feasible from an ecology point of view. There, now they added a concept of an eco-sensitive zone. Eco-sensitive zone is exclusively an area within a radius of 10 kilometers of a national park or a sanctuary where there is protection given. It's as good as inviolate. It's a second round of protection which is given for these protected areas. And there are different categories of activities which are totally prohibited or which are regulated to a certain extent, keeping the conservation of that protected area as the sole focal point. So whenever a project has to start within the radius of 10 kilometers, we have something called this eco-sensitive zone, forest and wildlife. So let me just again recap what we said. We were talking about 4 types of protected areas under the Indian Forest Act. That is again mainly for an administrative purpose. For wildlife conservation purpose, we have 5 categories of forests under the Wildlife Protection Act. In addition, we have this concept of a eco-sensitive zone, where another 10-kilometer radius around a sanctuary or a national park gets further protection. So this is the core concept of protection. Now, there are certain administrative categories also. I was talking about Project Tiger. Similarly, you have Project Elephant, Project Rhino, where elephant is the focus, rhino is the focus. So incidentally, their habitats also get protected. No reserves. But we as law students must understand there is no legislative sanctity for these kinds of reserves. These are administrative categories of protection of forest, but they are also very, very effective for individual species conservation. And then at the end of the day, when this entire etc. Went before the Supreme Court in one crucial case, there was a concept of private forest also. Some of the state laws, like for example, in the state legislations of Kerala, there is a concept of a private forest, where private individuals can hand over their forest to the government to be managed as a forest. So there was some discrepancy where one gentleman had handed over and it was not being done as per the mandate of the law. And there you have the famous case of Godavarman Tirumulpad versus Union of India. And after so many years of forest management and conservation in India, the courts realized the word forest has not been defined anywhere. And that is where the court set itself the task of defining forest. And it was a very simplified definition of forest, where the court said forest is the definition as given in the dictionary meaning of forest. Now, a lot of controversies, a lot of confusions created actually, because each dictionary has its own definition. So a whole lot of yardsticks had to be formulated, all that. But what we have to understand, because we're only restricting ourselves to basic concepts, the concept of deemed forest came in for the first time because of the interpretation given by the Supreme Court. So deemed forests are those forests where, as per the revenue records, as per any of these conservation or any of the official records, a particular territory may not be designated as forest, any of those forests that we just discussed, any of those categories. But for all practical purposes, when you actually go there, physically there are naturally growing trees, and it is a forest for all practical purposes. So wherever there are such areas, the Supreme Court said such forests, such areas should be construed as deemed forests. These areas should be deemed as forests, and the same kind of protection that we give forests should also be given to this category. Sorry. So then what happened was, who is to decide that a particular territory is deemed forest or not? So there again, the Supreme Court told all the state governments, please prepare a list of areas which can be categorized as deemed forest, present it to us, and then we will make that official. Excuse me. So a lot of action taken reports were called from various state governments by the Supreme Court. Governments were not very diligent, and a whole lot of other things happened. Then we have something called the Central Empowered Committee that was constituted. The long and short of it is, I mean, if we have to discuss the case of Godavarman, we will require an entire week, not just a day. There are so many interesting orders that were passed by the Supreme Court. Suffice to say that if the Supreme Court had not stepped in at that point of time, we probably would not have had the forest that we have today. It was one instance where the Supreme Court literally took over the forest management of the entire country to try and save, because there were so many pulls and pressures on the forest resources, and they found that the administration was not just lacking, but not doing anything. And they had to step in, because if it was not the court, then there was no one else to save these precious resources. So that is where we have this category of deemed forests coming in. So where a particular area is considered as deemed forest, protection is given like as good as a reserve forest. And whatever applies for the use of forest resources will become applicable when it comes to any kind of project coming up in that area as well. So this is as far as the categorization of forests is concerned. Now, since you have a separate center and all of you are so interested in field of environment, you must have come across concepts like biodiversity hotspot, hottest hotspots, all that. See, these are all concepts which are coined in by international organizations like UNESCO. There are a whole lot of conservation programs that are evolved by various bodies of the UN, chiefly the UNESCO. There is something called the Man and Biosphere project. So under that, you have the concept of biosphere, Western Ghats, for example. There are certain areas throughout the world which are identified as biosphere reserves. Then you also have the concept of a World Heritage Site, where certain natural territories are identified for the sheer heritage of its floral and faunal populations. Those are designated as World Heritage Sites by UNESCO. So you have international management regulations being applied. Then you have the concept of hotspots. In our country, we have the Western Ghats and we have the Northeast, where we have two hottest hotspots, as we call, because it has been found that we have such endemic, unique species in these two ecosystems that even a slight change in the ecosystem can destroy these species forever. And therefore, they have to be conserved, not just for the country, not just for the sake of the species, but for mankind itself, because they are a part of our heritage, hottest hotspots, the most sensitive spots on Earth. So we have two such in our country. So there are a whole lot of these concepts that you will come across when you read about conservation. Those are all categories which have been given by various organizations under various projects. So as students of law, what we have to understand from a practical point of view is, in a court of law, what is finally applicable is what is categorized under the Forest Acts, the Wildlife Protection Act, and the concept of eco-sensitive zones. It is only these categories that have some sanctity of judicial protection if there is any kind of violation. Now, having said that, we have to be very practical. Animals know no boundaries. So this entire system that has been set up by the government, the protected area network, as we call it, national parks, sanctuaries, conservation reserves, tiger reserves, all these things, it's not even 5% of the overall required territory that has to be protected. And the actual animal population is found more outside these territories than within these territories. But nonetheless, we have these categorizations because the understanding is, at the rate we are losing our species, animals and biodiversity by and large, let at least these protected areas stand as protected, protective fences or boundaries for these species of animals. Okay, so now when we are talking about, so that is as far as the categorization is concerned. Now, in terms of the actual kind of protection, whether the kind of protection that has been provided for in law is actually being given in these areas on ground, that is something we have to understand. And unfortunately, the answer is no. Because there are two concepts when we are talking about declaration of a protected area. Now, if all of you have done land acquisition laws, two main concepts. There is something called a preliminary notification, and there is something called a final notification. Preliminary notification is where the land acquisition officer, here in this case, it will be a forest officer who will be designated for the purpose, will call for settlement of rights, as we call it, where he issues a public notice and says, whoever has got any rights in this particular area, which we want to declare as a protected area, please come with your rights and title documents, and then let us see whether we can give you those rights or we can give you alternate rights, etc. So the preliminary notification is where that aspect happens, where they're calling for objections, calling for rights for settlement. Final notification is where all these rights are settled. And once the final notification is issued, that particular area is a national park or a sanctuary, and all the restrictions which are given as per law will be implemented in that particular area. Now, the real problem here is the slip between the cup and the lip, as we say. For more than 25 to 35 years, there are areas which have been intended where the government has issued the preliminary notification saying that we have decided to, declare this area as a national park or as a sanctuary. 25, 30 years have lapsed, but final notification has not been done as yet. So practically what is happening, all of us know that this is a sanctuary or a national park intended to be, but because settlement of rights have not happened, people are still exploiting resources. Until such time the final notification is not issued, the concerned authorities, which is basically the forest department, is not able to intervene and restrict movement and say, we will penalize you, don't enter. That is not happening. And this is not just because there are some practical difficulties, it is because of a lot of political interference. Because invariably, the people who stay within these areas, which are sought to be declared as protected areas, form vote banks for the local politicians. So the local politicians tell them, if you vote for us, we will make sure that you are not removed from that place. And at the end of the day, the executive has its own restrictions when it comes to their political bosses. So the unfortunate ground reality is we do have finally notified national parks and sanctuaries, but there are twice the number of those that are notified, which are yet to be notified. So we have very, very rich biodiversity, wildlife habitats, which should be protected as early as possible, not being protected only because of this ground reality, the technicality of the final notification not being issued. That is one aspect of it. I was talking about the eco-sensitive zone. We have something called the eco-sensitive zone notification that has to take place. So let us say there is a national park or a sanctuary where the final notification has taken place. So therefore, they are able to protect that area. People are not able to get into that particular national park or sanctuary. Now we are giving an outer ring of protection in the form of a 10-kilometer radius of eco-sensitive zone. Now, there also, because these eco-sensitive zones are not notified, exploitation is taking place. So again, what happens? 10 kilometers around a protected area, very good ecology, second round of protection for the animals of that protected area is being exploited because, again, political pressure, they are not allowing the department to finally notify the eco-sensitive zones. I think in Karnataka, we must be having, I think just about 50-60%, that too over the period of last 2 years, I think they have managed to notify some of these eco-sensitive zones. So from a practicing point of view, for a lawyer, it becomes a problem. We can go on telling the court, this is the most important habitat in town, but the court will say, where is the notification? There is no final notification to say it's a national park or a sanctuary. There is no final notification to say it is an eco-sensitive zone. So the court's hands are also tied. Only up to a certain extent the court can help us. They can use all those principles that all of you must be aware of: precautionary principle, polluter pays principle, sustainable development. All these are there theoretically, but on ground, when you don't have these most important notifications, which empowers the court also to say this is right and this is wrong, we have exploitation of these resources taking place. And very often it is mining and stone quarrying that happens right in the heart of national parks and eco-sensitive zones. The less said, the better. So that is the unfortunate bit. We are a country where we have excellent laws, and we have other countries, emulating our laws. But when it comes to implementation, less said, the better. Okay, so that is as far as territorial protection is concerned. Now we also have to understand which are the agencies that actually implement these protective measures. All of us know when it comes to a forest situation, it is the forest department. That is the department which is exclusively meant to protect forest and wildlife. Now, even within the department itself, we have two main categories. We have something called as the territorial division, and we have something called as the wildlife division. So territorial division is exclusively dealing with protecting forest, as in the landscape, etc. Wildlife division is for the purpose of the implementation of the Wildlife Protection Act. So anything pertaining to Wildlife Protection Act, you have the Wildlife Division of the Forest Department, and the highest officer when it comes to any issues pertaining to wildlife conservation within the state hierarchy of the Forest Department is the Chief Wildlife Warden. Along with the Chief Wildlife Warden, we have another set of people and they are called as the honorary wildlife wardens. Now, invariably, these honorary wildlife wardens are civilians who have made some sort of a contribution to the field of conservation, and they are taken in to help the chief wildlife warden to be the interface between the government and the individuals or communities around forest areas. Because again, remember, we are looking at participative management and conservation. So we need someone to be that link between the government and the people, and the wildlife wardens do that bit. Now, coming to the actual hierarchy of the forest department itself, we have to be aware of who is manning who, because if you look into these laws, there are specific functions given to specific categories of officers. There is a mention of a range forest officer in the laws. There is a mention of a principal, a conservator in the laws. There is a mention of chief wildlife warden. So how do we talk about the hierarchy? When we are talking about any kind of implementation, for example, if there was some hunting or something, that some wildlife crime that happened, and it comes before the magistrate, the first thing that the accused can point out is the person who investigated was not of the appropriate rank. So, which is why, as students of law, we need to understand the hierarchy of the forest department. So, at the lowest rung, you have something called each forest is divided into various divisions. There are small divisions of territory which are called as beats, BEATS, beats. And each beat is in charge of one forester and one guard. One forester and one guard. These are the people who actually patrol these forests every day, morning, noon, and night. These are the ones who are facing the dangers of animal attacks. These are the ones who are fodder for the poacher's gun. These are the ones who are there facing the ground realities of, or the ground dangers of forest protection, the foresters and the watchers and the guards. So you have the beat, then a cluster of beats form a range. And there is something called as the range forest officer who is in charge of a range. Then there is a cluster of ranges, and that comes under an officer called as the DCF, the Deputy Conservator of Forest, or we also call him as the DFO. Then above him, we have the Chief Conservator. Above the Chief Conservator, in some states, we have the APCCF, the Assistant Principal Chief Conservator of Forest. Some states don't have that post altogether. After that, we have the PCCF. PCCF is the highest officer in the territorial division. Incidentally, just to ensure that there is coordination between the territorial wing and the wildlife wing, it is the PCCF himself who is the Chief Wildlife Warden also. So this is the hierarchy of the forest department, which we have to keep in mind. Okay. Then we have something called as the anti-poaching camp concept. Okay, these are again administrative measures. Anti-poaching, there are so many such concepts. And there are also concepts of a core zone, a buffer zone, a periphery zone. These are all concepts which are adopted by the forest department for the internal management of forests. So what are these? As I said, in a protected area like a national park, it's a total inviolate area. But within that also, they will identify a core area. And if there is poaching happening there, they will set up poaching camps over there. They will have 24/7 surveillance teams doing the rounds over there. So then we have a periphery. Periphery is towards the outer side. We have a buffer zone where we have village communities to some extent, getting into the forest. So these are all the administrative aspects. Why I'm mentioning all this is, let's understand forest management from the forest department point of view also, because very often we get orders in court, but when we have to implement it, we have to go back to the same department. So it's so important, we need to understand what are the ground realities of that department, whether whatever we get from court are actually implementable on ground or not. And the unfortunate situation right now in the forest departments throughout the country is we have more than 50% vacancy in the field positions. So no matter what orders you get, if there is a shortage of hands, you know how effective that is going to be. And in terms of equipment, so much for the government saying they're giving this fund, that fund, and so many equipments, we are not properly equipped. Any day, the poacher has a much better version of, the latest version of a rifle or a gun as compared to the department staff. And I think this is a situation which is across all government departments, and the forest department is no different. In fact, we should be very, very thankful to the forest department for whatever little forest and wildlife we have, despite all these odds that they have to face on ground. So that is the hierarchy of the forest department. Now, there are certain interesting statutory authorities which have been established for forest management, specifically under the the Wildlife Protection Act. Let's try and understand what these authorities are. I already told you all about the Chief Wildlife Warden, so we need not visit that again. Chief Wildlife Warden, as I said, all there are various restrictions in these protected areas, but there are exceptions also. So if in some situation the Chief Wildlife Warden permits us, for the purpose of research or for the purpose of photography, to enter an inviolate area, that becomes an exception. And sorry, if an animal has to be culled because it's turning out to be a threat to life and limb, suppose there is a man-eater tiger right in the middle of the national park, then with the permission of the Chief Wildlife Warden, that animal can be culled. Culled means killed. So for all those purposes, it is a Chief Wildlife Warden. Then we have something called as the Central Zoo Authority. Central Zoo Authority is exclusively for administration of zoos. I don't think we need to get too much into it. Very interesting and very important authority that was created by a subsequent amendment, 2006, Wildlife Crime Control Bureau. You all must be aware that next to narcotics, wildlife is the biggest money churner in the black market, wildlife trade. And India is one of the hottest hunting grounds when it comes to wildlife trade and practice. A lot of it goes towards China. I mean, there are specific routes where all these products go. So understanding the huge amount of resources that we are losing, the government realized it's not enough for just the forest department or just the customs department or the police department. We need people who are specialized and exclusively concentrating on curtailing wildlife trade. And that's where you have the Wildlife Crime Control Bureau. Similarly, we have something called as the National Tiger Conservation Authority. National Tiger Conservation Authority, again, an offshoot of all the tiger conservation measures that we adopted. So this National Tiger Conservation Authority is the nodal authority, which is to take all decisions pertaining to conservation of tiger reserves and tiger protection related issues, to the extent that if a project happens to have any impact on a tiger reserve or in and around a tiger reserve, the no objection of the National Tiger Conservation Authority is a mandatory requirement. If the National Tiger Conservation Authority, or the NTCA as we call it, does not permit a particular project, then no matter what all other clearances you have got, you cannot go ahead with that project. So that is the importance of the NTCA. Similarly, we have two other important boards, which is the National Board for Wildlife and the State Board for Wildlife. Again, whenever it comes to a national park or a sanctuary, if someone has to alter the boundaries of these protected areas or denotify a sanctuary declared by the state government, or denotify a national park declared by the central government, then it is a must and should that the national board or the state board for wildlife, whichever the case may be, depending on where it is situated and who has declared it as a protected area, this particular board has to be approached, and only if the board approves, then that particular area can be denotified. Similarly, if there's any project which is coming anywhere inside the national park or in the vicinity of a national park, or even within the eco-sensitive zone, then the state board and the national boards have to give their permission. So there are any number of instances where we have, projects which are crores of rupees worth. They have got all the other environmental clearances, but the national board will not approve of it, and you cannot go ahead. That entire project falls. Or the National Tiger Conservation Authority does not approve of it, and the entire thing goes for a toss. So as of now, we owe a lot to these statutory bodies for the way they have managed to stall ecologically destructive projects. Be it railways, and again, let's remember, it's not always big companies which are looking at ravaging the ecology with all these projects. Unfortunately, today, we are in a situation where the biggest denuder of forest and wildlife habitat is the government itself. We have this mad drive for infrastructure, and invariably they're looking at infrastructures like railway lines and roads through national parks and sanctuaries only. There are alternatives, but no, they want to go through these parks only. And it becomes a little tough. And today we are in a situation where even these boards are getting compromised. I'll tell you how. In fact, right now I'm handling a matter in the High Court where we have challenged the constitution of the State Board for Wildlife. If you look into the Wildlife Protection Act, along with the government appointments into the board, there are 10 members who are non-government entities, not necessarily NGOs. Anyone who is an eminent ecologist or a conservationist or an environmentalist, 10 such persons are supposed to be included. Some NGOs are supposed to be included. So now what they're doing is whoever is a pro-government person is being appointed under this category also, so that whoever gets appointed will toe the line of the government, because there are some very important projects, destructive projects, which have been stalled so far by the non-government members of these boards. So now the government is trying to eat into the root of these bodies itself by appointing people who will tag the line of the government. So all this is happening. The ground reality is very, very disturbing. And it's all very well for us as students of law to know what the law is, what kind of precedents have been given by our courts, what kind of conventions are there on the international stage, all that. But we must understand the ground reality is very different. And that is where we as students of law can make all the difference. If you are able, since you have a separate center, I'm saying this, if you are able to build the trust and confidence of the locals in and around forest areas, they will turn informers, and you in turn can help the department, can help lawyers who are handling these conservation issues to take it to the court of law. See, very often just about 2% of issues are coming before. I think even that is an overstatement. Not even 2% of violations in forest and conservation laws is being brought to the court. So we are so much for all these laws and conventions. When we are not even activating them, what is the point? They are not finding any realization on ground. So so I think a center like yours, where all of you are so enthusiastic about this, try to be on the field, try to become that important link between the field and the court, and it will go a long way in preserving. So I think I will end on that note. I had
First question is from Nihat S. He has asked, please shed some light on the jurisdiction of NGT, and I would particularly like to know, why is NGT not given power to take suo motu cognizance based on news reports, etc.?
Okay, that's a good question. Technically speaking, since our topic of discussion today is forest and wildlife conservation, NGT does not handle wildlife conservation. So there are some laws which are outside the purview of NGT. Okay, this NGT is a very interesting setup. See, as I said, in the Godavarman case, the Supreme Court took up the entire forest management of the country. And it became very, very tough for the Supreme Court to handle, because there were so many IAs coming in from across the country. And there were so many technical issues that were coming up along with it, that the Supreme Court said, we cannot handle this. We need to have a separate committee or a body or something. And that is how they created the CEC, Central Empowered Committee. Central Empowered Committee also, at the end of the day, were not equipped enough to handle these. And that is when you have the NGT. We have a separate statute where the NGT has been established by virtue of that statute. And the NGT is supposed to go into very in-depth details of all these kinds of applications that come, or petitions that come pertaining to environment and conservation issues. All the environmental laws, the Environmental Protection Act, all the circulars under the Environmental Protection Act, Air Act, Water Act, Forest Conservation, all these issues have to go only to the NGT. In fact, the high courts cannot deal with those matters which come within the jurisdiction of the NGT. And the NGT has a panel of judges, which it's reflective of judicial as well as technical members, so that they understand the issue for what it is. So they give orders, And invariably, NGT orders are challenged in the Supreme Court. So you're back to Supreme Court again. You're just having a via media. Supreme Court said we don't have time, created the NGT, and the NGT gives orders, again, it gets challenged. And the NGT per se cannot take, see, suo motu cognizance is a concept which came as a concept of, as a part and parcel of the PIL movement, the public interest litigation movement, where the courts used their inherent powers and they said, you must have heard of epistolary jurisdiction, where even letters were treated as petitions. That is available only for a court of record like a High Court or a Supreme Court. Whereas NGT is a tribunal, it's a quasi-judicial body. It is not a regular court per se. So which is why you cannot have suo motu cognizance. And sorry, the NGT also is overburdened today. So today, as a conservation lawyer, the first thing that we have to think is, which fora should we approach? Should we go to the High Court? Should we go to the NGT? Or should we directly go to the Supreme Court? There are instances where we've gone to the Supreme Court directly because we said, let's save time going to the High Court, NGT, and then, Supreme Court. Supreme Court has remanded it back saying, no, you have a hierarchy of courts. We have something called as forum convenience. Your local High Court is the best to look into the matter. Go back to your High Court. There are also instances now where we are addressing environmental issues under Civil Procedure Code, believe it or not, and it's very, very effective. I'll tell you how. Under Civil Procedure Code, there is a section. I am not going to tell you section. I want you all to go back and look into CPC. It comes anywhere between 90 to 96, section 90 to 96 of CPC. See which of them. I will give you the gist of the section, and you figure out which section I'm talking about. Sorry, I have a sore throat, so please bear with me. So it talks about a class litigation where there is some kind of a public nuisance. A group of people can approach the court and activate the jurisdiction of the local civil court. And you can ask for injunction orders against projects under Order 39, Rule 1 and 2. And today, as practicing advocates, we find the district courts are more effective and more speedy in stopping projects than the Supreme Court or the High Courts. So much for all the writ jurisdiction and jurisprudence. We are looking at it very, very practically. There's something going on there. We want to immediately stop it, go to CPC and do it. So this is the ground reality. So NGT, yes, it's there. The reason no suo motu pas, as I said, it's not a code of records. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, ma'am. So proceeding towards the next question, we have question from Chinmaya Prasanna. He has asked, what is your opinion on the utmost good faith clause in the new draft bill?
I have a lot of problems with the bill itself. And this utmost good faith is whose good faith? There has to be some kind of yardstick. There has to be some kind of criteria. This is like how we say a reasonable man. Now, your concept of a reasonable man is different from my concept of a reasonable man. So it's a very, very subjective phrase. So I would honestly feel that it needs a little more of description. In fact, this is exactly the problem we are facing right now. I was talking about the State Wildlife Board. See, the Act says, the Wildlife Protection Act says, an eminent, note the words, eminent ecologist, environmentalist, conservationist. Who is eminent? And who is an ecologist? Who is a conservationist? What are the yardsticks? In fact, right now we have given some 3-4 research papers on what could be a possible definition. In fact, we're seeking a definition from the court today because there are no yardsticks. So the same situation will happen with this utmost good faith also. It is finally what we think is utmost good faith that will be good faith. So it is all very subjective, needs more description.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is from Sandeep Vijay Nayak. He has asked, why are humans allowed to inhabit forest land? Why are they not banned from forest land?
I wish I had an answer. I wish I could have some magical powers and say, off with your heads the minute you enter forest lands. That's a reality. There are some questions which have no answers. They're just there.
Okay, ma'am. So the next question is from Rashmi Singh. She has asked, do you think development and environment could go hand in hand?
See, that is what sustainable development is supposed to be. Where we are supposed to balance environment and developmental issues. See, at the end of the day, we cannot say let's protect ecology and let's not develop. We have to be practical. Development also has to happen, but in a sustainable way. So, of course, again, like so many other jurisprudential concepts, we have something called as the cost benefit analysis, where whenever a project is taken, we kind of look at it on a scale. We put environment on one side, we put development on the other side, and we try to understand if development takes place, are the repercussions going to be so irreparable or irreversible that we will lose so much of the environment that we will not be able to resurrect it? And then we look at the environment angle and we say, can we afford to lose a few thousand trees because this development project which is going to come up is going to give us electricity, is going to give so many people jobs, livelihood. So this is more important. We have mouths to feed. So out of the 10 lakh trees, can we lose 1,000 trees? If we lose those 1,000 trees, what are the ecological repercussions? So, these scales keep going up and down, up and down. So finally, at some point of time, someone decides that the project has to go through, it goes through. Someone decides it does not have to go through, it goes through. It's all hit and miss. I'm being very practical over here. Yes, environment and development equally important, but the entire gamut of environment jurisprudence is how do you balance the two of them? And the argument continues.
He has asked, as a developing and most densely populated without consuming forests and natural resources, what's our economic position?
I would never want to answer that question because that is exactly what the government says whenever it comes up with some destructive project. It says we have mouths to feed, we have to create employment, we need to advance economically, we want to become a developed country. But not always. See, that is where we need to understand. Today, it is not only about money and livelihood. We must realize this. This is the hard reality. Today, we are facing existential questions. We are facing survival questions. We are facing questions of fresh air and pure water. And it is not even that. We don't know when the land next to you is going to cave in. We don't know when the hill next to your house is going to topple on top of your house. That is the kind of situation we are in. It's a very, very crucial situation. All of you are looking at the climate change patterns, sudden floods, sudden tsunamis, and sudden earthquakes, cloud bursts. So these are also existential questions. So that's what it really depends on the powers that be for that particular project as to where they want to lay their weight. So if they say no, all this can happen, we want people to be economically prosperous, you have no choice, you have to go ahead. But then if you are going to be looking at the prosperity of a few thousands, what if the lakhs are going to be faced with such natural calamities? Then again, the government, has to face the consequences. So again, these are all questions that can go on getting debated. But finally, it is that one person who signs over there, it is his individual discretion that decides the final status of that project. Yes.
Okay, ma'am. So the next question is from Deepika. She has asked, ma'am, can we blame human activities for the exploitation or any kind of harm that is being done to the forest and its resources?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If there is no human intervention, nature takes its own course. The best conservation, we say, is just let nature be. Don't put fences, don't do anything. Nature knows how to cure itself. And the lockdown period is where all of you must have read so many articles where suddenly the air was clear, suddenly you had peacocks in the middle of the cities, suddenly you had all kinds of species of animals being visible. Suddenly the clouds were all, the peaks which were not visible for so many years became visible because the smog of the area was not there anymore. And in fact, the best conservation, we say, is not, suppose there is denudation in a particular area. Experts say the best way to resurrect that area is to leave that area undisturbed for a period of 15 to 20 years so that the natural vegetation regenerates itself. You don't have to go and plant trees. This concept of reforestation, where we are planting trees, is not always technically sound. If you have to have an ecologically, a good quality of forest, you have to allow the forest to rejuvenate by itself. So the best conservation is no human interference. And yes, if there is any problem with our ecology today, absolutely because of human interference. There's no doubt about that.
Okay, ma'am. So I have a question, ma'am. The question is, what is the solution for the elephants entering the estates in certain areas? How can both the owner of the estate and the animal be protected and benefited side by side without a clash?
To begin with, we are in elephant habitat. We have encroached their land. So we are the encroachers. We don't want to look at it that way, you know. In fact, there are instances, especially in the Hassan Shimoga belt, where the plantation owners are willing to give up their estates because that is the kind of human animal conflict that is happening there. Day in and day out, they're living in absolute fear of animal attack. But the government does not have funds. Now, if I'm giving up my plantation, I cannot just give it free of cost because I have my family and I have my livelihood concerns too. If I am given ample compensation, I am only too happy to give up my land and move away. In fact, any person who is living on the fringe areas or these plantation owners who are there, uh, by default, if you ask them, they'll say, we'll be only too happy to give up this land because practically we know there is no solution for this. But then they have to live because they have no choice. So given that, what is the solution? Well, see, animals follow their natural corridors. All these days, they had sufficient habitat, so they were within the jungle. They had sufficient food. They had sufficient water resources within their area. But today, they are in a fragmented habitat. You have roads, you have rails, you have plantations, you have agricultural lands right in the middle of the forest. Animals are extremely sensitive to human presence. In fact, once they get to know that a particular area has been visited by a human being, they don't go to that area at all because they're so scared. So the more interference in the forest areas, the more you are restricting the territory of these animals. And there does come a point where they have no choice but to step out. It's not like they're very happy to come and invade and destroy crops or plantations or attack people. They're not left with a choice. For them, it is survival. If I don't get food in my forest, I will come for your jackfruit tree or your banana tree. And if I don't have enough, see, these are all territorial animals. They require huge areas in terms of square kilometers. Each tiger has its own territory for about 25 to 50 kilometers. So that is the kind of territory they're used to. So you restrict them, they're obviously going to look for new ground. And incidentally, in that new ground, if there is human habitation, you can't really blame the animal. And if you're looking at solutions, well, there are electric fences being set up where animals are dying because of it. I don't know ethically if it's right or not, but no practical solution except for probably the human beings to leave that area and for the government to arrange for a proper rehabilitation package. In fact, this is exactly what people in the fringe areas are asking for, but the government is not doing anything about it. So the problem stays.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much. There's another question in the chat box by Smalan. Ma'am, what are the average number of cases that are filed in the Bangalore High Court on environmental conservation in a year? Or sorry, ma'am, further the question extends, or the ratio between criminal cases and environmental conservation cases?
See, I cannot give you figures because I don't have them. And when you're talking about the nature of cases that are being filed in the High Court, first and foremost, I'll be very practical. It depends on how green the bench is. In the case of Karnataka High Court, all these matters go before the first court, as we call, which is a bench headed by the Chief Justice. So we had a situation, of course, the last 2 years, we've been very lucky, touch wood. We've had a very, very receptive Chief Justice who was very, very green at heart and went out of his way for these green causes. So we had a flood of green litigations coming in. But before that, for nearly about 5 to 6 years, none of us ventured anywhere near that court because we did not have judges who understood the green cause. These were people who encouraged corporations on mining, industries, all that. And in fact, there were a couple of chief justices who even levied costs for disturbing the court with such insignificant issues. So that is where, instead of going to the High Court, we looked and explored the district courts under CPC. Lawyers also become innovative. As Dr. Subramaniam was saying before we started the talk, you need to know everything about every field of law because you don't know when what is going to become handy. So when all of you are getting equipped in various fields, don't ask yourselves, why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? Tomorrow, I'm not going to be doing this. I'm going only to this field. You never know when what becomes handy. So we lawyers also keep innovating. Sometimes we don't, we make green issues as brown issues. So when we know that there is a bench which is not receptive to an environment cause, we convert it into a land revenue issue. So instead of focusing on the environment aspect, we will focus on the land aspect and we'll catch them on that. And, we'll stop the project. For example, there was one project in Chikmagalur, and it was pertaining to, we were talking about ecology and all that. Of course, it didn't come before the High Court, it came before the Environment Appellate Tribunal. And we just said that the land records were not appropriate, so therefore you cannot have it. So we did not even touch upon the ecological aspect. We wanted to stop it because of the ecological aspect. But we thought it was more practical before that forum to point out land records are not in order. And we stopped the project. So that is how we approach. So if you're asking me how many green causes come and what is the percentage, there is no hard and fast rule. It depends on how green the bench is. And in today's situation in the Karnataka High Court, we have a lot of pollution related cases than conservation cases, invariably. Because see, when you're talking about conservation litigation, it's a different ballgame altogether. Because you have to understand the field realities, you have to have a good rapport with the department, you have to liaison with the department to get documents, you have to understand what is happening in the middle of the forest. We have some very, very dedicated people who are exclusively into that field. So those kind of dedicated people will get some matters. But otherwise, by and large, if you're looking at environmental cases, we have a lot of air pollution, water pollution, lake pollution kind of cases that are currently there before the court. So I hope that answers your question.
Ma'am, there is one more question from Varshita R. She has asked, could you give any example of a wildlife sanctuary or a forest where wildlife is well protected and can go on without any human interference?
Fingers crossed, touchwood, Nagarhole National Park, Rajiv Gandhi National Park. That is considered as one of the best protected national parks in the country right now. If you want to know the worst protected national park, Bannerghatta National Park, which is hardly a national park, because quarrying is happening right in the middle of the national park. So I've given you two extremes.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was indeed a very interactive and information session for all of us. So